I didn't disappear overnight. I disappeared slowly. Over birthdays no one remembered. Holidays that passed without invitations. And phone calls that stopped coming back. For 10 years, I stayed exactly where they left me. Still cooking. Still waiting. Still believing that being patient meant being loved. They didn't push me away, they just forgot I was still here. Until one day, I made a choice that changed everything. I stopped reminding them I existed. And when they finally started looking for me, I was already gone. I stood alone in my kitchen on Thanksgiving morning, staring at a table set for people who never came. Stood alone in my kitchen on Thanksgiving morning, staring at a table set for people who never came. The turkey was ready. The food was still warm. 17 place settings sat untouched. That was the moment I finally understood something I had been refusing to face for years. 10 years of begging for scraps of attention from my own children hadn't just hurt me. They had broken something inside me that would never heal the same way again. My name is Margaret Holloway. I am 71 years old now, and this is the story of what happens when kindness is mistaken for weakness, and silence is mistaken for acceptance. Before I go on, let me ask you something. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or state in the comments. I often wonder how many people listening to stories like mine feel just as invisible. Now let me take you back to where everything began. 36 years ago, I married the love of my life, Daniel. We built our life together in a quiet suburb outside Hartford, a place where neighbors waved and children rode bikes until sunset. We raised 3 children in that house, celebrating birthdays, graduations, holidays, and everything in between. Daniel worked in commercial property management. I spent over 3 decades as a public school librarian. We weren't flashy. We weren't extravagant. But we were stable, comfortable, and deeply proud of the family we had built. Daniel was my best friend. Every morning, he kissed my forehead before getting out of bed. Every evening, we sat together on the back deck, iced tea in the summer, hot soup in the winter, talking about ordinary things that felt extraordinary simply because we were together. Our home was always full. Holiday dinners. Sunday meals. Grandchildren running through the halls. Laughter that spilled from room to room. Our children, Emily, Jonathan, and Rachel, were our entire world. Or at least, I believed we were theirs. Then, one morning in early spring, everything changed. Daniel collapsed in our bedroom while getting dressed for work. The paramedics worked on him for nearly 40 minutes. I watched from the hallway as they tried everything, compressions, shocks, prayers whispered under breath. But my husband was gone. A massive heart attack. He was 67 years old. At the funeral, the church was full. Hundreds of people came. Everyone spoke about what a generous man Daniel had been, how dependable, how kind. I stood there in black, numb, holding myself together for our children. That night, after the house finally emptied, my children sat with me in the living room. We'll get through this together, Mom, Emily said. You won't be alone. I believed her. I believed all of them. And for a little while, it felt true. For the first few months after Daniel passed, my children checked in often. Emily called every Sunday night. Jonathan stopped by on his way home from work. Rachel texted me photos of the kids, asking if I needed anything. I told myself this was what healing looked like. Grief shared. Loss softened by family, but slowly, so slowly I almost didn't notice, it began to change. The Sunday calls became every other week. Then once a month. Then only when I called first. When I mentioned it, Emily laughed it off. Mom, life's just busy right now. Jonathan said work had been overwhelming. Rachel told me I should get out more so I wouldn't feel lonely. So I tried. I joined a book club at the library. I volunteered at the community center. I told myself independence was healthy. But independence doesn't feel like silence. The holidays were the hardest. The first Thanksgiving after Daniel's death, only one child came and left early. The second year, they suggested celebrating another time that never happened. By the third year, I was eating dinner alone in front of the television, watching other families laugh through commercials meant to sell togetherness. I told myself not to be dramatic. They had families of their own now. Careers. Responsibilities. Still, there were moments that hurt more than I expected. Like the time I slipped on the front steps and bruised my hip badly. I called Jonathan, then Emily. No answer. Rachel texted back hours later. Hope you're okay, Red Heart. I sat on the couch with an ice pack and realized no one was coming. Little by little, my place in their lives changed. I wasn't mom anymore. I was a reminder. An obligation. Someone they meant to check on, but never quite got around to. Years passed that way. Birthdays acknowledged with quick messages. Holidays negotiated like inconveniences. Grandchildren growing older without really knowing me. And still, I stayed quiet. Because mothers are taught that love means patience, that asking for too much is selfish. That being forgotten is something you endure with grace. By the time I reached my 70th birthday, something had become painfully clear. My children hadn't drifted away. They had moved on. And they hadn't noticed that I was still standing right where they left me. There was something my children never talked about. Money. Not in concern. Not in planning. Not in care. Only in assumption. After Daniel passed, I became responsible for everything: bills, taxes, investments, and accounts I had never managed alone before. At first, it overwhelmed me, but over time, I learned. I learned how to read statements. How to ask questions. How to see patterns I had ignored for decades. Daniel had been careful. Quietly careful. He left behind more than just a paid-off house and a modest savings account. There were long-term investments. Retirement funds. Insurance policies that had matured quietly in the background of our lives. Not millions, not yet, but enough to live comfortably for the rest of my life if handled wisely. My children never asked. Not once. They never asked if I was managing okay. Never asked if I needed help with finances. Never asked what plans I had for the future. Instead, they spoke in assumptions. You'll probably stay in the house, right? It makes sense for you to leave things the way they are. We can help when it's time. When it's time. The phrase unsettled me. It suggested they were waiting. Not actively, but patiently. As if my life were a pause between their plans. One afternoon, while organizing old files, I found a letter Daniel had written years before and never mailed. It was addressed to me, sealed but forgotten in a drawer. I opened it with shaking hands. Inside, he had written about fear. Fear of being taken for granted. Fear of becoming invisible with age. Fear that kindness might one day be mistaken for consent. Ended the letter with a sentence that stayed with me long after I folded the paper back into place. If I go first, promise me you'll protect yourself even from the people who love you. That was the moment something shifted. I realized my children weren't cruel, they were comfortable. Comfortable assuming I would always be there. Comfortable assuming I would never change. Comfortable assuming everything I had would eventually become theirs, without ever asking how I felt about it. That night, I sat at the kitchen table and looked around the house that still smelled faintly of Daniel's cologne, and for the first time in years, I asked myself a question I had never allowed before. What if I stopped waiting to be remembered? What if I chose myself instead? I didn't confront my children, I didn't announce a change. I didn't give warnings. I simply became quiet in a different way. Instead of waiting for phone calls, I stopped reaching out. Instead of asking for invitations, I began declining them when they came, rare as they were. Then I started preparing. I met with a financial advisor in a small office downtown, someone Daniel and I had never used before. I wanted fresh eyes. No history. No assumptions. For the first time, everything was laid out clearly. Accounts. Assets. Future projections. I listened more than I spoke. The advisor asked a simple question: what kind of life do you want now? No one had asked me that in years. I updated my will. I reorganized beneficiary designations. I set up a trust, quietly, legally, completely within my rights. Nothing illegal. Nothing dramatic. Just intentional. I also sold things. Not furniture, not memories. I sold obligations. The oversized house that echoed with silence. The responsibilities no one noticed I carried. The role of always available mother. The house sold faster than I expected. When Emily found out, she sounded surprised, but not concerned. You didn't tell us you were thinking of selling. I wasn't, I said. I already did. There was a pause on the line. Well, where are you going to live? I haven't decided yet. That answer unsettled her more than the sale itself. Jonathan asked if I was okay. Rachel asked if this was a phase. None of them asked why. I downsized. I simplified. I stopped explaining. Each small decision made me feel lighter. Stronger. And for the first time since Daniel died, I slept through the night. They didn't know it yet, but the life they assumed would always remain exactly where it was already disappearing, and I was no longer afraid of being alone. I was afraid of staying. I didn't announce my move. One day, I was simply gone. No forwarding address. No dramatic goodbye. No explanation. I kept my phone number, but I stopped answering right away. Messages came in slowly at first. Hey mom, just checking in. Did you move already? Call me when you get this. Days passed. Then the tone changed. Where are you? Are you okay? Mom, this isn't funny. I watched the messages stack up without responding, not out of cruelty. Out of clarity. For years, my silence meant patience. Now, it meant boundaries. They tried each other next. Then neighbors. Then the realtor. When Emily finally reached me, her voice was tight. Why didn't you tell us you were leaving? I didn't know I needed permission, I said. That stopped her. Jonathan wanted to know if I was sick. Rachel asked if I was angry. I told them the truth, gently, calmly. I needed space to figure out who I am when I'm not waiting for someone to remember me. They didn't understand. To them, my disappearance felt sudden. To me, it had been 10 years in the making. What they didn't know, what none of them had bothered to ask, was that everything had already been handled. The accounts. The documents. The future. Nothing was missing. Except their certainty. For the first time, they were the ones reaching out, wondering where I was, wondering what I was thinking, wondering what they might lose, and for the first time in my life as a mother. I didn't rush to reassure them. I didn't vanish forever. I just stopped being available on demand. I moved to a small coastal town nearly 4 hours away, somewhere no one expected me to go. I rented a modest apartment with white walls and large windows that faced the water. In the mornings, I walked along the shoreline with a cup of coffee and no schedule to keep. In the evenings, I read until I was tired, not until I was lonely. Weeks turned into months. My children adjusted. Not gracefully, but realistically. They learned that love doesn't always mean access. That motherhood doesn't erase a woman's right to choose herself. That silence can be a sentence, not a mistake. Eventually, we talked. Not in accusations. Not in tears. In honesty. I told them I loved them, but I would no longer disappear inside that love. I explained that everything I had built with their father was protected, intentional, and settled. There were no surprises waiting for them, only boundaries. Some were hurt. Some were defensive. Some finally listened. As for me, I stopped waiting for holidays to feel whole. I stopped measuring my worth by how often my phone rang. I stopped believing that being forgotten meant being unimportant. I was never invisible, I was just standing still while everyone else kept moving. And when I finally chose myself, I didn't lose my family. I found my life. If you're listening to this and feel like the quiet one in the room, the one who gives, waits, and hopes, know this. It's never too late to step out of the silence.